Hi, welcome to the Free Exchange, hosted by the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise here at Lindenwood University. I'm discussing the topic of public debt with my colleague Howard Wall, who is director of the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise. Welcome to the show, Howard.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And we're talking about public debt because we have a conference coming up on crony capitalism. And if you're going to be a crony, you've got to have money to fund all of this. And so I guess one really elegant way to do that is through public debt. So I have a bunch of questions, and what I'm going to do during our interview today is I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to try and defend the use of public debt.
Great.
And you're going to have to tell me why I'm wrong. So
Okay,
first,
well, I'm not so necessarily just dead set against it. It's just,
okay, yeah.
But we'll see.
We'll see what the positives and the negatives are.
Have at it.
Okay. Well, first of all, just talk to us like we're children. How does the government go into debt? There's something like bonds or something? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the government spends money, and it finances that spending by levying taxes. When it doesn't raise enough taxes for all of its spending, the government borrows money by issuing bonds. A bond is a promise to pay back money in whatever the maturity of the bond is.
With interest.
With interest. So
Right.
the bond is just the treasury bonds, T-bills, all of these things are just forms of government debt, government borrowing.
And these can be bought by anyone. They're traded.
Right,
And,
anyone
yeah.
can buy them. People in the country, people out of the country, institutions, individuals, the Federal Reserve,
Okay.
banks.
Okay. So I was just at a conference on Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton wanted to acquire some debt. And the reason that he did is because, we were a burgeoning little country and we didn't look like we were going to last. I think everybody in 1812 thought that, we were just going to be reabsorbed into England. And so he knew in the 1790s that we needed to establish our reputation, basically, with the other countries. And so basically carrying a debt and making our payments on a regular basis made us look legit. So would that be one positive use?
Right, well, so
debt?
one of the decisions made was what to do with all of the state's debt that had accumulated during the Revolution, and then some of the national debt. And what they did, Hamilton was behind this, was to nationalize all of the debt and to commit to paying it back.
And the states were reneging, I think, on their debts, right? They were
Right.
not making payments, yeah.
Right, and this was part of Hamilton's argument for a strong central government, at least for this purpose, was to, the financial strength of the United States was strongly linked to whether or not they actually paid their debts or not. And then they did. They paid off the debts. And it did establish the U.S. as a viable country, at least in financial markets.
Okay.
And the U.S. had borrowed, or the colonies had borrowed lots of money from foreign creditors, and they paid them back.
Right, and they'd done that for the purpose of war, not
Right.
for the purpose of the revolution.
Right.
And so, what about any kind of stimulating effects of debt? Is debt stimulating at all to the economy? Maybe if people are feeling doubtful or starting to panic.
There's some debt that people often make use the analogy of people borrowing money and being in debt and the government, and you shouldn't be in debt and so on. And it's not perfect, but sometimes it works fine. It's perfectly okay to go into debt to actually invest, right? Maybe you're investing in national defense.
Yeah.
Or something that will be productive for years to come, and this means that you're producing something or doing something that will have a return. Like with the military, it could be that you'll exist in 30 years.
So stop people from blowing you up or something.
So that could be a worthwhile investment, and the return is that your economy keeps existing.
So
or you build bridges,
infrastructure,
and that has a return on it, and you can pay that back. So that kind of debt, if you're careful about it, you can make the argument that that's a good idea.
The idea is that you'll bring in greater revenue, so you'll be able to pay it back. Just like if I'm going to take out a loan, it's because I'm going to be doing something that's going to have some profit that I can pay off the interest with.
Well, even if you're not getting the revenue, it still could be worthwhile because of.
Okay.
But you can if you're making an actual investment, something that has some sort of return over time. And then the stimulative effect, it's now it's debt just to pay for current expenditure is a bad idea, right? There's a difference between borrowing in order to invest and borrowing to consume.
Yeah, it would be like me putting my groceries on a credit card.
Right.
Or something. And you'd think I'd be in a very bad place if I was doing that.
Right. So the federal government, borrowing in order to pay out welfare payments, Social Security payments, medical payments, stuff like that, non-investments, is borrowing in order to consume. You don't get a return on that in the future.
Right.
So you're not going to be able to pay that off with higher GDP or higher incomes later. So it's just borrowing to cover your spending.
Okay.
Which in the short run is also might be fine if you're expecting to return back to either surplus or to at least a balanced budget, but that's not any longer the expectation. The expectation is that you can do this infinitely, and that's where it's a bad idea. Because right now the U.S. is borrowing, 35, 40 cents on the dollar for every dollar they spend. So it's just a huge deficit that they've been running. It's now 400 and some billion dollars a year. It was $1 trillion, so I guess that's an improvement.
And our total debt is 17 trillion.
$17 trillion.
Yeah. And not going down anytime soon. It went down a little bit in the 90s.
It was projected that it would be, I think some projections saw that it could be almost gone by this time. Projections made in, say, 1999, when we were actually starting to run small budget surpluses at the federal level.
Yeah.
But those surpluses are long gone.
Sure. So I want to get back to some of the details, but just a big question is, why not have these huge debts? I mean, you've got this panic over debt. My philosopher that I wrote my dissertation on, David Hume, just hated the abuse of public debt, and he said it was going to weaken the country, and the country was going to be overrun. And it you might say you're crying wolf. I mean, here we are. We've had these huge debts for a long time. I mean, I guess we didn't really start using public debt until a couple of hundred years ago, but in this century, you have European countries who have very high percentages of their GDPs in debt and carrying trillions of dollars for years and years and years, and nothing terrible seems to be happening, right? And so what's the problem? Why all the concern about debt? Why can't we just go on like this?
Well, it's incorrect that nothing terrible is happening.
Okay.
Because and in terms of this question, it is definitely a longer run question in most cases.
Okay.
So for the United States, we can continue along this path for a long time, but we're paying a big cost every year because resources are going into paying back the interest on this debt.
Right.
That is not being used for other things.
So it's don't ignore the opportunity costs.
Right. So our opportunity costs for this are high. So we're rich and we'll continue to be rich compared to 200 years ago or 50 years ago, whatever. But we could do an awful lot better, except we're burdening ourselves with this debt that does not have anything to do with investment.
Right.
It's just debt for spending purposes.
Yeah, and when the economy is doing not as well as it could be, clearly the more sort of desperate members of society are going to have a much harder time than you or I, getting through a tough economy. And they're the ones that'll be harmed the worst.
And at some point you run out of other people's money to spend. And what do? You have to stop spending on necessary things, especially if you've decided to spend on unnecessary things, or you weren't careful, but you've locked yourself into a lot of spending, and then when there's actual things you need to spend money on, you don't have access to it.
So one of the points that Hume makes, which I just love, is he's looking at incentives. He's very interested in human nature, and he's saying, if somebody wants to, he calls it, cutting a figure, right? The public figure. You can have a wonderful project, pay for it through debt. Nobody has to deal with the costs of the project. You can pat yourself on the back for doing it, and get elected again or whatever. And you don't have to think about it until your children have to think about it, or your grandchildren have to think about it. And so all that means is that you have a huge temptation to constantly be doing this and to be almost creating projects to spend money on that you can put off the cost of, because that's going to be good for your political career and your constituents will love it, and nobody's really counting the cost. So what you get then is a unruly expansion of the abuse of public debt.
Well, if you look at our own state of Missouri, we're one of the leading states in giving out tax credits to businesses.
Yeah.
In all sorts of forms. But and this is a way for governments of different levels to take credit for whatever economic activity happens.
Yeah, they can say,
right?
we created this.
We created this. This program created these jobs, when most of that is a complete lie. Most of the jobs would have happened anyway, or whatever is happening is not worth the expenditure. So Missouri spends something in the order of $800 million a year on these credits. And there's just this is the accumulation of these credits.
Yeah.
And this is just handouts for virtually no effect, hopefully no effect, because mostly it would be a negative effect. But politicians love these things because you can see the benefits, the alleged benefits, because they're at every ribbon cutting.
That's right.
For all of these, they've got the golden shovels ready to dig that first.
It's concentrated benefits, dispersed costs.
But we don't even see the costs, because there's this illusion that this is actually doing some creation, whereas all it is a transfer from one to another. Right? It's not a creation.
Right. And you don't see what never happened. Right. Because you put your resources in one direction rather than in another.
Right, and then the debt is paid off. It's the foregone taxes, and you're not actually writing a check. You're giving a tax break, so you're never actually handing money over. It's just that they don't give you money later. That in the normal course of events they would have given to you.
Right.
So it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, but it's just basically writing $1 million checks to millionaires. Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of other problems with the debt that people bring up that I want to talk about after the break. So for instance, who owns the debt and whether or not there are foreign policy implications with that. I know that comes up sometimes. So when we come back from the break, I just want to talk about more critiques of our public debt. So join us after the break. Thank you.
Lindenwood University. It's where you can get an education steeped in 187 years of tradition, but in tune with the needs of students of today. Lindenwood is where the liberal arts thrive. It's where young people and working adults can prepare for the next great step in their lives. Lindenwood has more than 120 degree programs from which to choose, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and a doctoral degree in education. Lindenwood has tradition, a sprawling modern campus, a supportive faculty known for its one-on-one attention, and personal financial aid assistance to help new students and parents feel comfortable with their college choice. Lindenwood offers the best of the St. Louis region, with a college town experience in St. Charles, Missouri. Find out why thousands are choosing Lindenwood University. Find out today. You can reach us online at www.lindenwood.edu or call 636-949-4949.
Every budget, so don't accept defeat.
Now you can get covered and still buy me treats.
You take care of your pets. Now it's their turn to take care of you. Visit getcoveredamerica.org to learn about your health insurance options.
Hi, and welcome back to Free Exchange, where my colleague Howard Wall and I are discussing public debt. And so, Howard, before we get into some of the foreign policy critiques, let's talk about our current debt that we're holding here in the U.S. right now. What's the status?
The U.S. has been the economy's been very weak for a few years now, and we have accumulating this huge debt, running a big deficit, and often people say that this is okay because we need this to stimulate the economy. But this is it's a Keynesian prescription. It's a so-called Keynesian prescription. To get the economy going, you just borrow money and spend. Government spending will have this multiplier effect. But not to defend Keynes too much, but this is completely wrong in terms of what Keynes himself said.
Yeah, and I've heard very conservative economists say the same thing, that the Keynesians are different from Keynes himself.
Right. It's a perfectly it's intellectually possible. It's a respectable view to say that when you have a sudden, say, downturn in the economy, there's a loss of confidence, that you can spend money, borrow money, spend money, inject money into the economy from the government, and then this will bolster the economy and then return it back to normal.
The idea is that you're trying to stop the panic.
Right.
That there can be a snowball effect with the panic, and if you can just kind of boost people's confidence, then you can just keep the ball rolling.
Right, and this is meant to be a temporary measure to get you out of this recession or depression.
And pay it back right away.
And you run this debt and then immediately return to running a surplus to pay back the debt that you accumulated. It's not meant to be a permanent feature of the economy. And now it's Keynesianism. When you can believe that or not believe it, it's a very interesting question. But now Keynesianism has become, running huge deficits infinitely into the future. When it's mostly now in the U.S., the increase in the debt that will be continuing. It's been falling the last couple of years, but it's projected to just keep rising and rising. It's all about entitlement programs, not about investments or anything like that. It's just these programs are just by demographics are just going to rise over time.
Right.
And unless something's done to reform those, there's nothing we can do to get rid of this debt.
And primarily that's Social Security and Medicaid?
Social Security and Medicaid,
Yeah, are the big guns out there. And of course, I pay into Social Security, so why is Social Security a problem? Don't I pay in all my life and then they just give me my money back at the end?
Well, there's this mistaken belief that you're paying into some account. Because you get a report every year as if you have an account. But that money immediately goes out to pay beneficiaries. Right? Currently retired people are being paid by currently working people. And as the economy ages, baby boomers become retired, fewer and fewer people are supporting, or working people are supporting each retiree.
So we don't have enough to pay out.
Right, so it's a pay-as-you-go system, and it's not a retirement account.
Right.
So that's a burden. That's a burden for the future. That is, going to be part of the huge debt that we pay because we're no longer bringing in as much Social Security taxes as we're paying out.
And I guess philosophically, this is all mixed up with the whole big government, small government question, because if you want to limit the number of unnecessary wars you're involved in, or you want to limit the amount of social engineering you're trying to accomplish, and so forth, right? If you have kind of a minimal state approach, philosophically, then you want to limit the ways, the enabling factors for doing those things, right? And public debt makes it easy and even attractive to just add to the number of things that the state is doing and intervening in all the time. And so we don't have to count the cost of anything that we're doing. And I know, Kant and others talked about being very careful about the use of public debt because of that.
Well, the biggest times of public debt for the United States have been war times. Right? You look at in the 20th century, it was World War I, World War II, Korea, were huge spikes in public debt. And I think it's difficult certainly World War II, it's difficult to say that debt, once you're in the war, you shouldn't try to run a balanced budget. Because you don't have enough money to do it. So you run up a huge debt. And then you pay it off, although largely it was inflated away. But that was an investment of some sort.
We still had to pay. I mean, if it's inflated away, then everybody's dollar is thinner, right? So you pay in your consumer prices.
But now the biggest non-war accumulation of debt is what's been happening in the last 10 years.
Okay, 10 years.
10 to 15 years.
And what's that?
Well, since 2000. It's been the welfare programs. It's not been investing in the military. I mean, part of it is the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but those are not huge drivers of the debt.
I remember hearing that you were being sort of surprised that we may be spending a lot of money on these wars, but compared to what we're spending on some of our entitlement programs, it's actually not that much.
It's absolutely dwarfed by all of these other things that are going on. And there was a $800 billion stimulus package in 2009, which has been a permanent increase in spending, basically. And that also dwarfs. I mean, that 1 year is comparable to what's been spent, over 10 years of war.
And I know, not to get too far afield, but I know that I thought that your view on that was not that there wasn't some intervention needed at that time, but that it was not done in a disciplined way. I mean, in other words, some of the rescuing that we did was more total.
Well, again, that wasn't very Keynesian. Keynes would say either cut taxes or just write checks and give it out to people.
To spend. Not bailing out these particular
This was wasting money. It was doing things with government money that the people did not want. Lots of green subsidies, a huge chunk of it was just transferred to state and local governments so they could cover their spending. So this was not meant to be is not designed very well as a Keynesian stimulus. It was a huge, gigantic pork package.
Yeah.
Government pork, which has become a permanent feature.
And
you could argue that if it was done correctly as a stimulus package, where you write checks and get it, then it would work. I don't believe that myself, but it's intellectually defensible to say that. So you can say I tell people that this was not a test of Keynesian economics. Because they didn't do what they were supposed to. They just did really.
And the recovery's been very poor.
Recovery's been historically weak.
Yeah.
And it's only been strengthening once government spending has reduced. Right. So these things go hand in hand. But once the clamps were put down, or were put on spending, and on some of the new regulations and new programs, has the recovery even begun to start going?
Okay.
And also having the unemployment benefits extensions ending.
Because now that's interesting. You mean it's important that they end because you need to get people sort of motivated to get back into the workforce?
Right. So the unemployment benefits, during the recession, you could understand why they would be extended because it was a terrible recession.
Sure, right.
But you have to balance that against the effect that this has on people taking jobs or not.
Yeah.
If you're on unemployment, then you're less likely to take a job that opportunity that comes along.
Momentum.
You'll wait for more. And that has good things and bad things, but it's just a fact of life that people are much more likely to take a job at the date that their unemployment benefits end. You see this in the data all of the time.
Sure.
And there are different estimates of the size of this. And there was one that was way too high, of like 1.5 million jobs created just because the unemployment benefit extension was eliminated. That's in like a year and a half's time. But it's probably more in the order of 700,000-800,000 jobs, which is still a lot.
Yeah.
Which is a significant percentage of job creation, was because people were no longer being paid to not work.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about this foreign policy thing. And I'll tell you, I don't totally understand it. I mean, I know there's a concern that, say China owns a lot of our bonds. So, is the fear that they'll cash them all in at one time and bankrupt us? Or I don't understand exactly what the threat is supposed to be.
Well, this is one of the cases where sovereign debt, government debt is very different from individual debt, because they can't just decide to cash it in, right? The debt holders can't all decide to cash it in at once, because you can easily renege.
Okay.
Right? As a sovereign government, you can default, and there's no recourse other than in financial markets.
Right.
But the United States probably wouldn't suffer very much. If China was able to gather together all the debt that its private companies and government entities owned, says, we want to collect on this now, we're not going to roll it over, perhaps the U.S. would just say, no. We're going to do it this way.
And that wouldn't hurt us terribly? In terms of our sort of global credit score?
It wouldn't hurt us enough to not do it. It means that it would hurt China more, so China doesn't have the incentive to actually do that.
Okay.
So it just doesn't come up.
Okay. It's not something they would do just out of sheer
Yeah, I mean, the expression is what? If you borrow $1,000 from the bank owns you. If you borrow $10 million, you own the bank.
Okay, explain that.
Well, if the bank you borrowed a lot of money from the bank, now your financial health is...
yes. If you default,
they're in trouble. Then they're in big trouble.
And
you see this now with Greece in Europe, right?
Okay.
Greek debt is, you'd say, oh, that's a Greek problem, but it's not. It's because all these European banks are holding Greek debt.
Yes.
And if Greece defaults, then everyone else loses, because they're holding significant parts of their debt.
So you don't really fear in other words, for you, you don't consider it to be a problem that other foreign nations, even ones that are perhaps hostile to us, own huge portions of our debt. You don't consider that to be any kind of a foreign policy.
I think a lot of the fears are overblown.
Okay.
I don't say that I don't worry about it at all.
Okay.
But I think now I'm not really concerned. it's kind of secondary. It's just a bad idea to have all this debt to begin with.
Yeah, okay, right,
whether we're owing it to ourselves or someone else's.
Okay, and then what about these third world countries? You know, you hear about debt forgiveness. This is one of Bono's big things with third world countries where they get in trouble and they're borrowing a lot, but they don't really have the infrastructure. I mean, they're not necessarily using it for investment, and so you don't see them being able to maintain it.
The U.S. can always pay back its debt.
Yeah.
A lot of countries cannot because they accumulated the debt in order to do projects, or it was just siphoned off to Swiss bank accounts or whatever, and then it was not used to invest in something to then be productive later on. But then the debt is due, but you're still a poor country, and then it's the debt is blamed for the poverty, whereas it's the kleptocracy.
Yeah, I'm thinking
else.
It's of corruption. It's a lot of corruption that causes the debt to be misused. And then what, do you have an opinion on whether or not these debts should be forgiven or whether they should be held to them as some sort of form of discipline?
It depends.
Yeah.
It depends. Different countries are different situations. So a lot of Latin American countries, say Argentina gets into this problem routinely, and they fritter away the debt, and there's lots of corruption and bad governing. But then, I don't know why everyone would lend the money over and over. But
why do we?
Well, here it's not. It's banks doing it. It's the private sector that's doing it.
Yeah.
So
you'd think you wouldn't buy their bonds if they're not very likely to pay them back.
It's fairly predictable that they default every 10, 15 years or something, so I don't know.
You don't know what's behind that.
I guess you end up feeling that you're going to be bailed out or something along those lines.
But then with some of these really desperate sort of third world kind of
it's what do you do? You know, their rulers, corrupt rulers, borrowed all this money that we told them to borrow or allowed them to borrow.
Yeah.
And then nothing happened, and then it's still an impoverished country.
And part of it seems like you don't. I mean, obviously you need to talk about a solution, but on the other hand, you kind of want to blame the problem in the first place. In other words, how in the world were they given this, these monies? Because a lot of times it seems like well-intentioned stupidity that has caused us to lend.
Now, a country like Greece is not one of these cases because they just took the money, frittered it away, lied about their own finances.
Yeah.
And they're in the euro, which is unfortunate for them because they can't just devalue their currency because they don't have their own currency. But they just took the money and fraudulently and spent it very poorly, and now they're wanting it to be forgiven.
Yeah.
So I have very little sympathy. But the rest of Europe is in a tight spot because European banks own the Greek debt.
Yeah, and it could cause a huge
and
crash.
For up until recently, Greek debt was counted as riskless when banks determined how much risk they were carrying, even though it obviously was not. So banks overcommitted to Greek debt, and now they're kind of left holding the bag.
Yeah. So there's lots more we could talk about on public debt, but I think we've covered a few important topics. So thank you for joining me. And please check us out on the web at lindenwood.edu/Hammond Institute.